These two Polish writers and their short stories from the 1930s offer something strange, uncanny. There are deep psychological insights and analyses taking place. There's a penchant for the absurd, the paradoxical, the transformative, the gothic, the mysterious, the philosophical, and in some cases even perhaps the surreal. These stories are odd, they're wild, they're dark and funny. Really, they contain everything that I need when delving into a lovely, dusty smelling book with my morning coffee. Yes, so today we are talking about Bruno Schulz and Witold Gombrowicz. These are two wonderful writers of Polish modernism, and they are even considered as anticipating postmodernism in many ways. Perhaps they're bridging that gap a little bit between the modern and postmodern. And they are a little lesser known in the Anglosphere, yes, but their works have managed to gain widespread attention from later great writers, from Roberto Bolaño, Salman Rushdie, even the theater of the absurd taking place in the mid-20th century, or even writers like John Updike, who went on to refer to Gombrowicz specifically as one of the profoundest of the late moderns. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with these two writers, please, if these descriptions do interest you, check them out. There have been some great translations coming out for these writers recently and within the past 20 years or so. So helping to spread these works around for more of us English speakers, which is great, obviously. Now, let's start with Bruno Schulz. Who was he? And yes, I'm going to give a little bit of biographical background for who these authors are. No, I'm not one of those people who thinks it's necessary to know the complete biography of every author that you intend on reading. But at the same time, it's just an interest of mine of knowing a little bit about the backgrounds, at least, of the authors, where they're coming from, what environment they're writing in. No artist creates something out of a vacuum. These people are living within a certain environment, atmosphere, and are responding to these in many ways. So, who was he? Who was Bruno Schulz? He was from a Jewish family, Jewish background, although he was raised rather secularly in Poland. He was born in a small town, which was at the time in the 1890s, right around the turn of the century, at the time was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which then, following the end of World War I, the redrawing of the map of Europe, his hometown fell within the borders of Poland. So right there you can see that he's living through this period of change in the modern era, in the early 20th century, especially in Eastern Europe. Borders are changing, cultures are kind of mingling in different ways, languages and cultures. And of course, along with the changes of the map of Europe that are taking place, there's also the rise of fascism elsewhere in Europe. So a lot of change going on all around him. So in the 1930s, he wrote a couple of collections of short stories. The first one being called Cinnamon Shops, and the second one called Sanatorium Under the Sign of the Hourglass. So at the same time in the 1930s, he was also a celebrated sketch artist, illustrator, and which I will show you this. So this is not a book we're looking at today. This is Gombrowicz' first novel, which came out in 1937, I believe. But if you can see the illustration there, that is actually an illustration done by Bruno Schulz. You could see how kind of surreal it is. It's like this tree figure that's morphing into multiple human entities. They're like the people are emerging out of the tree in some strange, fantastical or surreal way. So that's Bruno Schulz's illustrations. So this is the 1930s. He's kind of making a name for himself. And then, of course, World War II comes along, 1939. Bruno Schulz then found himself living within the Jewish ghetto of his hometown in Poland. He remained there until 1942, when he was randomly and tragically shot and killed by an SS officer out in public in the streets of his hometown. And that's it. That's kind of all we have of Bruno Schulz. He never got to finishing the novel that he always wanted to write. So all we have are these short stories of his, these collections of short stories. And actually, I should note, there's been a very recent discovery within the past couple years. There was a Ukrainian researcher a couple years ago who discovered this kind of masochistic story filled with a lot of imagery and literary techniques that are common in Schulz's writing. It turned out what this researcher found was an early short story written by Bruno Schulz from the 1920s, prior to his publications. And yeah, so this early story was published under a pseudonym in, I believe it was a newspaper or some kind of magazine publication. And so that story is also presented here in this lovely new edition and translation of Schulz's stories that I have here. So this is published by Pushkin Press in 2022, and it is translated by Stanley Bill. So Pushkin Press is a British publisher that aims to rediscover a lot of lesser known classics of European non-English works. And really the intention is to bring them into new English translations for English readers, to spread these works around. So this is a collection of Schulz's short stories, and the publishers decided to call it Nocturnal Apparitions. So it's a lovely little publication with a short but informative introduction to the author, and also to the recent discovery of that short story that I was talking about. Now, I don't speak Polish at all, so I can't say too much about the translation, but it seems to be a solid rendering. And as Stanley Bill states in his foreword, my aim in this book has been to render a lively selection of Schulz's best fiction for the general reader in a style that is both accessible and true to his complex imagination. And what a complex imagination that Schulz has. His writing is overloaded with metaphor piling upon metaphor. These stories are poetic. They're avant-garde. Due to these piling metaphors, they display uncanny transformations throughout the stories. One can make connections certainly to Kafka. Schulz even helped in a translation of Kafka's The Trial into Polish somewhere in the 1930s. There are these transformations or metamorphoses of landscapes, of nightscapes, of characters. These transformations all create these surreal, dreamlike, or nightmarish even stories. And as Stanley Bill describes in the foreword about Schulz's writing, his long sentences pile one wildly imaginative metaphor on top of another, creating a sense of excess, instability, and constant transformation as ordinary objects undergo unexpected metamorphoses or reveal glimpses of mysterious inner lives. The plots of the stories are both easy and difficult to encapsulate. Not much happens in a literal sense, while at the same time a cavalcade of fantastical events unfolds in the narrator's imagination or in the contortions of the language itself. So both easy and difficult to encapsulate, certainly. I would often be reading the wonderful poetic prose of the stories, left scratching my head about what has been unfolding. But it's beautiful, it's dark and strange at the same time, and I just love it. The stories are all linked and connected, usually from the perspective of a child, where the father throughout the stories is ill and he's having these strange, what Stanley Bill describes as madcap flights of fancy, progressively dragging him away from the world of his family in a series of disturbing metamorphoses. So it's just a strange way how they're all linked, and they all seem similar but different and transforming in different ways in all of the different stories. And now I just wanted to give you a little taste of Bruno here. So just eat this up. This is from the second story in the collection called Visitation. So in those days, our town was already falling ever further into the chronic grayness of dusk, its edges overgrown with a lichen of shadow, a fluffy mold, a moss the color of iron. Scarcely disgorged from the brown smoke and mist of the morning, the day slid straight into an amber-colored afternoon, paused for a moment, transparent and golden as dark ale, and then descended into the fragmented, fantastical vaults of the sprawling, colorful night. Isn't that just amazing? The transformations of the day from the eerie, fluffy mold of dusk to the transparent and golden afternoon, and finally the fragmented, fantastical vaults of the sprawling, colorful night. So it's almost like he's painting, but doing so in a series of paintings for us. And with words, of course, and also in a mere few lines. His writing is packed with examples like this. It's very illustrative. It's very, transformative and surreal and poetic, metaphorical. It's a shame that Schulz's life ended so prematurely when it did, and so tragically. It would be a real pleasure to see what a novel would have been like from Schulz. And now let us move on to the witty Witold Gombrowicz, a contemporary of Schulz's. They knew each other in the 1930s in Poland. Both were at least somewhat acclaimed in the literary circles of Poland, although both were also somewhat criticized by some of the elite over their over-the-top strangeness and degeneracy, literary degeneracy, if you can call it, as they would call it. Who was Witold Gombrowicz? Just reading from the back of the book here, one of the reviews. As in Gombrowicz's airily bizarre novels, lucid, concise narratives are weighted with outrageous premises and absurd developments that recall the work of Kafka, Beckett, Bruno Schulz, and especially Ionesco. Quick aside, I really do need to get into Ionesco one of these days, one of the authors on my ever-expanding infinite list of books to get to. So Gombrowicz was born in Poland in 1904 to a wealthy Polish family. These stories, his first publication, came out in 1933. He went on to write novels as well, such as Ferdydurka, which I already showed you, and then also Pornografia, and my personal favorite, Cosmos, which came out in the 60s. I want to say 65 or 66. He received acclaim instantly in Poland in the 30s, although he was not known in the English-speaking world until much later. Now, both Polish writers living in Poland in the 1930s, we saw how with Schulz, he ended up kind of trapped within the Jewish ghetto in Poland during World War II. Odd story with Gombrowicz, he ended up a little bit lucky regarding World War II. So in 1939, just prior to the Nazi invasion of Poland, Gombrowicz decided to go on a little trip to South America. So he was sailing across the Atlantic towards South America. On his journey, the war broke out, and Gombrowicz decided to hold out in Argentina for the duration of the war. So yeah, it just completely by chance avoids the conflict going on in Europe. And he ends up staying in Argentina for much longer. He stays there, living mostly in Buenos Aires until about 1963. And then in 1963 he moves back to Europe, but not to Poland. He ends up in France, living first in Paris and then later in Nice in the south of France. So this latter portion of his life was spent completely in exile from his homeland of Poland. And while he was from a wealthy family originally, he did endure poverty throughout his life, especially while he was living in Argentina. And so considering his exile, in much of his work, as in his stories here, Gombrowicz shows a kind of anti-nationalism, or at least a critique of Polish high society and culture, these kind of old world class systems that Gombrowicz would have been all too familiar with in his youth. So this publication by Archipelago Books, Archipelago is a publisher who puts out a number of great translations of 20th century European writers. Other examples include Robert Musil, for example. So this publication, again, a good introduction. It's a little brief in this one. The introduction by Bill Johnston, the translator. But yeah, it gives a brief intro to the author and to these stories. Now, this is a 2004 translation done by Johnston. So Johnston is an American translator who translates Polish literature into English. So he seems to be a highly acclaimed translator. As for the rest of Gombrowicz's writings, his novels, his diary, there's another fantastic translator, Danuta Borchardt, who has done a great job over the past 20 years translating the rest of Gombrowicz's works. As far as I know, I don't think there is a translation of hers for these stories. But if you're seeking out any other writings by Gombrowicz, certainly get a hold of the Danuta Borchardt translations. Any of the older translations, English translations, would have been translated not directly from the Polish. They were actually translated from French translations of Gombrowicz's writings. So Borchardt, as does Johnston here, they're translating directly from Gombrowicz's Polish. So let's start with the title here, Baka Kai. What is that? What is the meaning of this word? Is this a Polish name? Is it a Polish word? It's not actually Polish at all. It's quite random, in fact. So in 1933, when these stories were published originally in Poland, they were published under a different title. And the title that Gombrowicz gave them was Recollections of Adolescence, or at least that's the English translation of that title. It was during a later republication, I believe in the 1950s, possibly even later. It was in this later republication that Gombrowicz decided to give these stories a new title, or this collection of stories a new title. And that's where he came up with Baka Kai. And that name is in fact the name of the street that he lived on when he was in exile in Buenos Aires. So totally random, not connected to the stories at all, really. So yeah, why go through that name change? So Gombrowicz later went on to explain the reason for that. And there's a quote of him saying, being simply, quote, for the same reason that a person names a dog, to distinguish them from others. So totally random name, not connected to the stories, simply just to distinguish it from any other book of stories. So that's some of Gombrowicz's sense of humor, I suppose, which you certainly see in these stories as well. There's another quote from Gombrowicz about his writing and about literature in general, where he says, "From the beginning, the nonsensical and the absurd were very much to my liking." Already, just from the title here, we can see how this nonsensical and the absurd, we can see how Gombrowicz is fascinated in these things. These stories will certainly continue that trend. There's going to be nonsensical things occurring. There's going to be absurd things, all as Gombrowicz delves into strange literary parodies. There are parodies of adventure stories and folk tales, and even the detective story is parodied in here. So while the stories in all of Gombrowicz's writings really might be rather dark at times, there is always some underlying humor that's spread throughout. And it's often ridiculous, it's often absurd, or sometimes dark humor. And one thing I might add is that a lot of these stories have been reproduced over the years for the stage. Many of these productions can be found online as well. I've seen a number of them, and they're quite entertaining, humorous. It's interesting to see the display of these characters and these stories on the stage, and seeing how some of that humor emerges on the stage rather than through the text. So the stories, these stories might start with some kind of skeletal plot that might appear realistic. It might appear normal, but the stories quickly devolve into the absurd, but in a way that makes it feel like there's nothing really absurd going on at all. That line between reality and absurdity becomes blurred through Gombrowicz's writing, and I absolutely love that about him. It's fun, it's funny, it's dark, it's insightful. These stories are not as surreal or as metaphorical, perhaps, as Schulz's writings. There's no symbolism. That's one thing Gombrowicz claimed. So Gombrowicz's stories are more grounded in that boundary between the real and the absurd. They're dreamlike, but they're not over the top, and they don't flow with the same excess of metaphors that Schulz's writings do. And then there's Gombrowicz's influence from philosophy. By the way, there's this short nonfiction work by Gombrowicz called A Guide to Philosophy in 6 hours and 15 minutes. So if you have 6 hours and 15 minutes that you'd like to spend learning about the history of philosophy from Immanuel Kant to Heidegger, give that a shot. So in his writing, Gombrowicz is said to anticipate the existentialist movement of the 20th century. Gombrowicz, even after himself first reading Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness, which came out, I believe, in 1937, although I'd have to double check that. After Gombrowicz read that, he kind of he reflected on it and said, hey, this is kind of what I've been saying, or what I'm writing about as in these stories, which came out in 1933. So he kind of saw himself as anticipating this existentialist movement, and you can see that in a lot of the topics that he discusses, topics around, say, human essence, will, human identity, the challenge of human authenticity, of the inner self in conflict with the outer world, or with society, or between the self and one's nation that one is from, etc. So now I'd like to just briefly introduce one of the short stories in this collection. It's one of my favorites in here, and it's called A Premeditated Crime. So it's a parody of the crime genre, or the detective genre, and really it's kind of a reversal of the crime plot. And this story, or this genre that Gombrowicz is writing in, came to be referred to as metaphysical detective genre. Other authors who wrote in this genre as well include Edgar Allan Poe, Georges Perec, and almost Thomas Pynchon. So his novel, The Crime of Lot 49, is an example of that. And connected with that too, even in this story of Gombrowicz's, as in other of his writings, you get that sense of paranoia. There's this kind of anxiety that characters are going through, and this kind of paranoid feeling about like what is real, what is actually happening. Is this actually a crime taking place, or is it all in my head? Am I fabricating this? Is there some conspiracy? So that kind of might ring some bells with Thomas Pynchon and his, especially The Crime of Lot 49. That's the only one of Pynchon's books that I've read so far, so I can't speak on any others. So in this story, Gombrowicz considers the characteristics of reality, of interpretation, of humans' epistemic limitations, of subjectivity and narrative psychology. The main character has this growing sense of anxiety and stress, as I said, this kind of paranoia that builds and builds towards the end. And so the main character is a magistrate who visits this family. And so this family has someone who just passed away, an older man. And it seems that the man passed away by natural causes. And the magistrate can see from examining the corpse that it certainly was a natural death. However, he soon gets caught up in these ideas that there was perhaps a crime that took place, that he was maybe murdered. He doesn't know by whom yet. He goes through all the members of the family to see maybe there's connection there, even though really there's no real evidence to suggest that the man was murdered. So what's happening here is the magistrate is left trying to search for the real from within the imaginary. And thus he ends up internally changing the reality. He almost forces himself to believe that the reality is that the man was murdered. So much so that by the end of the story, the scene of the death gets physically transformed to make it seem that the death was in fact a murder. And the way the story unravels, it surprises the reader a little by the end. It's just a neat, weird, absurd twist of a straight-up detective story. Okay, so here I have a quote from Gombrowicz. This is from his memoirs, which was published in the 60s, I believe. And this can be found at the back of the book in the afterword to the book. So Gombrowicz says, "A writer can, if he wishes, describe reality as he sees it or as he imagines it to be. This produces realistic works, such as the books of Sienkiewicz, another Polish writer of the time. But he can also apply a different method in which reality is reduced to its component parts, after which these parts are used like bricks to construct a new edifice, a new world or microcosm, which ought to be different from the regular world and yet correspond with it in some way." So, yeah, and again, that distinction, that blurred distinction between reality and the imaginary, reality and absurdity. Like there's this groundwork of realism or this skeleton of realism, but the imaginary comes in and out of that, and the reader is left not completely taken away out of the reality. He's shown maybe these new worlds or these microcosms or this imaginary. There's still this connection or this tether to the real world. It's different, but it still corresponds to real life, to the real world in some ways. And with that, maybe there's something that the reader can learn about the world, can learn about themselves. Yeah, these are just some things about Gombrowicz's writings that I do love. So I will end there. Bruno Schulz, Witold Gombrowicz, check them out. Let me know what you think. I would love to hear. These are two authors that aren't spoken about too much in the English-speaking world where I'm from. Please let me know what you think. If you have read these works or these authors, if you haven't, hopefully you're excited about trying them out. And please let me know about any other authors that you could think of who, might be similar to these authors or to these styles. I'm always looking to learn about more, to find more great literature, of course. So yeah, we'll end there, and until next time, keep reading once again.